Hi everyone, welcome to my session today. Firstly, I hope you have had a wonderful day of learning, of exploring, of different educations, and really delving into the topic of diversity and inclusion. I'm so happy to be your closing keynote today, and I really hope we can go on a great journey together. I'm Sheree Atcheson, and I'm a multi-award-winning global diversity, equity, and inclusion executive. I've been doing this work for around 10 years, which feels like quite a long time, I think. And I've won a lot of different awards for my work for my services to diversity and inclusion in the industry. For me, diversity and inclusion is incredibly important in our daily lives, in our workplaces, and actually how just simply we exist. And that's why I'm really excited to talk to you about demanding more today, both for ourselves and for different people around us. What I think is really key here is that we recognize the journey that many of us are on. So, a bit about me before we get started, because I want to set the scene and kick off together with you. So, I'm the Global Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Executive at Valtech, which is a global design agency. I've held senior leadership roles at Deloitte, at Monzo Bank, at Pecan, and I've been working with hundreds of organizations to really help them move the needle through data-driven diversity and inclusion work. I'm an advisory board member at Women Who Code, and Women Who Code is the world's largest nonprofit globally dedicated to women in technology. I started my career with them around 7 or 8 years ago, where I led their UK expansion, helped them branch across EMEA, and now sit on the board to really help them from a strategic perspective. They have over 300,000 global members and a presence in over 60 cities where they run free monthly meetups in all the locations. I write quite a lot. Maybe I actually probably write too much, but I write for Forbes on privilege awareness, creating inclusive and accessible technologies, allyship, and so on. So if you're interested in finding out more about what goes on up here, you can find that on Forbes or Thomson Reuters as well. And I'm also the author of Demanding More, a book to help us all be the change that we need to create a more inclusive society. I hope you enjoy it if you've read it already, but absolutely you can get it anywhere too. I'm at Nirashika on Twitter if you're that way inclined, and you can always get me at shereeatcheson.com. So what I want to do with us for the time that you have with me, and please do post any and all questions into the chat. There is no need to think about, oh, maybe that's not a good question to ask. Ask it anyway, because I want to hear from you. Before we talk about actually what can we do more and do better, I actually want to share a bit about myself. I want us to take a step back. I want us to think about what it means to exist in the world from different perspectives. And I hope by sharing my story with you that will help you on this journey as well. So firstly, you may have noticed that I am Irish. Now, Irish people don't tend to look like me. And firstly, I know I'm incredibly cute in that photo. I don't know what happened, but here we are now. I was adopted at 3 weeks old from Sri Lanka by two white Irish people called Marion and George Atcheson. They adopted me when I was 3 weeks old, and my brother, who's also from a different Sri Lankan family, was also adopted. And we were raised in rural Ireland for all of our lives. Now, I want you to think about what that experience might mean in the 90s as well. Now, many of us have the experience of being the only, whether that's in your workplace, your team, your board, whatever it is. But actually, how many of us have the experience of being the only in your family, in your school, in your friend circle, when you go to family events? For example, you're the only, in my experience, the only brown person in the entire wedding or the entire whatever it might be. I want you to think about that experience of being acutely aware of being the only in that environment. Now, I grew up in Ireland, which obviously has had different experiences. Now, what I think is really important in that is to remember that I grew up in the rural part of Ireland. So 2% of Northern Ireland are from British or from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds. But actually, where I grew up was much more rural than that, because I describe it as when there was, lots of traffic on the roads, it's typically because someone has moved cattle from one field to another. Now, that's not an experience that a lot of people have, but that means it's very undiverse. Now, I did not grow up in a wealthy family. My family really were on benefits, and my parents ended up heavily disabled. I grew up on free school meals, which is a state-provided benefit here in the UK for families that do not have the money that you need to have lunch at school and so on. And I'm acutely aware of that nuance of both underrepresentation and privilege. I think what's really, really important for that is to remember both things can be true at once. When I think about my experience growing up in Ireland, firstly, one, the amount of privilege of being adopted for me has opened up my world to an entirely different perspective. Now, one of the other things that I think is key here is that there's no skill set in being adopted. There's no nuance, there's no skill in doing that, but simply it happened. And it meant that I have had all of these opportunities to change, to do more, and to do it better. Now, what I also think is key here is the transition of privilege that I have experienced as a financially stable woman now, who can comfortably talk about her partner who has some minor disabilities, but certainly across the spectrum of disabilities sits quite low. Now, what I want you to think about here as we talk about this is the nuance that privilege is not a 1 or 0 impact, but actually it's a very, very different perspective. Now, I've been back to Sri Lanka and I found my biological birth mother. Now, firstly, what I want you to think about is you exist in the world as we do, and you experience the world as you do. But actually, when you experience it in a very different world, where people look like you, where people are similar to you, where you don't feel like you stand out, not necessarily in a bad or a good way, but you just stand out, it's very, very different. Now, I've been back to Sri Lanka, like I said, I have found my birth mother. For me, it was purely out of curiosity. I am a very nosy person. And my parents had taken a number of photos of my dad and my birth mother when I was being adopted. And we were able to find her through a long search with media help and so on, and a hotline to find her. But we did find her. And I think what's incredibly interesting, I'm so sorry about my dog. What's incredibly interesting about that is that we were able to get that sense of understanding of actually what was my life and what could it have been had I not have left Sri Lanka. Now I have a half sister in Sri Lanka, and I've seen what her life was and is right now, and it's very, very different to the life that I have. I think it's really important to recognize that privilege in that one decision where I have been put up for adoption, and I'm very, very thankful for that, to where I am now. I also want you to think about the identities that we connect with, because we all have different identities. I have so many different identities. And I want you to think about those. Just take a very quick second to think about how you identify at the moment. Now, for me, I'm really proud of being Irish. It's something that is really strong with me because I was adopted. It's also one of the reasons, for example, that my name is Sheree Atcheson. I am married. My husband is Sean McCrory, but I kept my name because my name is so important to me. My dad, worked for years to be able to adopt us, and that name is really important to me. But the identity of being Irish is really important to me, and it's different. When you look at me, like, let me cover the mic, and this is intentional, it's not a technical fault. If I cover this, when you hear my name, Sheree Atcheson, and you hear my voice, boom, you do not expect me to look like how I do. So being Irish for me is a very different experience. The continuous being asking of where I'm really from, why I look like how I do, why I have this accent that doesn't quite match my face. And I went on a journey last year of getting my Irish passport, finally. And it was a lot of hoops to jump through, because Northern Ireland and Ireland are very different scenarios when it comes to understanding actually What policy do I fall into? Where is my adoption registered? Can I even get an Irish passport despite having Irish parents? Because the standard is if you have parents of a certain descent, you can get that passport. But actually, when you're adopted and when you're registered on the British register, despite your parents being Irish, you cannot get an Irish passport without jumping through a lot of different hoops. And that was something when my passport finally arrived after a year, quite a few weeks ago, actually, not too long ago. I don't really know how to explain that feeling, but it's very, very strange and very, I guess, empowering for me. I've always been Irish my entire life. I speak the language a bit. I used to speak it a lot more when I learnt it in school. I've won medals for Irish dancing and so on. I live that culture. But having that little book feels very, very different. I mean, I have it right now in my drawer, and it feels different. But I want you to think about those identities, what it means for you to exist, what it means for you to feel that sense of belonging. What I also want you to think about is, what about diversity and inclusion in that context? What about the inclusion for people around you? What about the privilege that you experience? Now, privilege, by dictionary definition, is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. Now, there is no skills in being privileged, okay? It is conditionally or completely luck. There's no skill set. You didn't earn it. It's simply there. That also means the absence of it is simply there. Now, I want you to think about the interconnected categorizations of privilege and linking into intersectionality, which really what we mean is the connection of, for example, race, class, and gender, and how they create overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. And I give you again myself as an example. Now, when you see me, you largely may consider me as a woman of color, but you don't really consider me, or nor should you consider me, just as a woman or a person of color. I am both of those things in its entirety. I'm not separately a woman, a person of color, and someone from a poorer background. I'm the culmination of all of those things, and that makes me who I am today. And I'm really comfortable with that awareness. But I also think it's really key that we recognize that privilege and underrepresentation can go hand in hand. I am very underrepresented as a senior leader in my field, as an award-winning leader, as a published author, as all of those cool things that I'm really proud of at 30. However, I am also very privileged because I am listened to. I mean, you're listening to me right now, I hope. But I think the key thing here is that for me, one of the biggest privileges is being listened to. Now, what that means is that people do not wait for you to finish speaking just so they can speak, but actually they sit back, maybe they cross their arms, and they listen, and then they create a response to that. Now, that's very different, and I have that privilege. Now, I want you to think right now, are you privileged? Take a second to think about that. My answer to you is that if you're listening to a session right now and have the time to learn, the time to come along, the time to sign up and maybe watch this later, you are privileged. We can both be privileged and underrepresented. That's something that I think is really important that we expand on when we start to think about how we demand more for ourselves and for people around us. Now, actually, what can we do about this? And again, please keep the questions coming. I can see them coming in at the side. Please do keep them coming in. We will have time at the end for me to answer all of your questions. I'm really excited for that. But what I want to leave you with is, what can we actually do about this? Firstly, I want you to remember this experience. Now, my experience is not the only experience, but I do think it's quite a varied one and quite a nuanced one. I've spent a lot of time really recognizing my own privilege, understanding the self-awareness, or delving into get self-awareness, to make sure that actually we and I do more than just creating diversity and inclusion strategies for those we directly identify with. One of my most popular Forbes pieces is called "Women Are Not a Monolith, and We Must Stop Treating Them as Such," because too many diversity and inclusion strategies, for example, only benefit heterosexual, non-disabled, financially stable white women. But actually, what about everybody else? So what I want you to think about in this, when you leave this room, when you leave this bubble of a room that we're in, I want you to think about how privilege manifests itself in your processes, in our ways of working. Who is able to pivot easily into the way we work right now? Who is being promoted higher than how they are represented in the numbers that they are in the business? Do we see underrepresented people disproportionately not being promoted? Do we recognize how privilege has manifested for those that are more represented in leadership, seeing more similar people to them moving up the ranks? Challenge that, and challenge it a lot. You'll need to use data for this. I used to be a software engineer. Data is super important to me. And I think it's really key that as we start to think about these things, you think about your data, you call that out. I really want you to remember that different people have different and unique experiences that have brought them to this moment right now. It's very easy to assume that we all sort of start at the same line, but we do not. You could argue that opportunity is there for everybody. This is the opportunity line, but actually the access points are simply not there for everyone. Okay, some people have been able to get through that. I am one of those people. But you got to remember that experience, that friction, that pushback. It gives me a very different experience for those that have had a much smoother journey into senior leadership. I want you to think about this when you come to decision making. Decision making in your daily lives, in your businesses, in your teams. Think about how you make decisions right now, how you decide yes or no on something. And what do you do to challenge any bias that you have in that? It's very easy to rest on our laurels and say, oh yes, well, we've always done it that way. Let's do it that way again, without actually challenging that environment. Empathy and consideration is really key here. That doesn't just mean fluffy statements, but actually considerate, deliberate empathy when you are rolling out changes, when you are considering changes, when you are reaching out to new people. Remember that actually words really do matter. And again, I know we say this a lot, but words and tone are key here. What's really important in that is to make sure that we take a step back and that we consider what we're about to do from different viewpoints. It's very easy for me to consider, well, listen, will this have an effect on me? No. Will I be okay with it? Yeah, I'll be fine with it. But actually, I'm not the majority of the company, am I? I'm not the majority of society either. And it's really key that we make sure we consider this for you, the majorities and the minority groups, to make sure that we are recognizing that privilege and being in that position of privilege is very, very different. It gives us an ability to change, an ability to do more, ability to demand more for more people, not just, for example, yourselves, but actually different people. I hope you've been able to gather this from my own story, but privilege really evolves and changes as we progress in our careers and our lives. It's very easy to consider the privilege that you've had earlier in your life to now as the same, and it largely will not be the same. Okay, one of the biggest parts of my book is on privilege. And I take us through an exercise called the privilege walk, which is a really well-known exercise where you answer, everybody starts on the same line. You should run this in your company, by the way. I've also open sourced that training. If you search for my name, you'll find that. But you all start at the same line. 53 questions are asked, and depending on your answer, you move forward or back. You can also do it remotely using a spreadsheet. And basically, it creates a scatter graph of people. But in my book, I explain through every question using data why we ask that question, why it's important to think about it, whether it's, do you need to use accessibility features on your phone? Have you had to ask for a seat on the train? Are you ever confused for catering staff when you attend an event? Are you regularly given the glue work, such as taking notes and so on, versus other colleagues of different genders? Those different kinds of questions, I think, really important because we have to recognize that things change. And my score on that exercise, certainly 5-6 years ago, was very different to my score now. I'm still in the minus level, but I'm moving quite up. I've moved up. I have financial privilege now. I have stability in a partner and so on. It's really key that we recognize that this is not ones or zeros. This is nuanced. I have to do this myself every day. So do you. Please do this. Challenge yourself on your bias, on your viewpoints, and your perspectives. What I think is really key is that we don't just sit back and recognize that or say, sorry, that, oh, well, I know that's right, so it's fine. Do research. especially if you're used to technologies, when you do user research before you define a solution or requirements, you should be doing similar when it comes to decision making, when it comes to even just how you respond to things. Sometimes I think it's very easy for us to just think this is the way things are, but I'm asking you to challenge yourself on that. Take the time, even if it's just a few seconds, to sit back and think, wait, am I doing that because of a different reason? Or why is that happening? I do it myself. I have to do it myself. I couldn't honestly say that I was doing this work well if I didn't take my own medicine. Before we move on to the final point, and again, keep the questions coming, I can see them coming through, which is fantastic. What I really want you to do, you've had a wonderful day of learning. You've had some great keynotes. I know you had Anne-Marie this morning, who's a wonderful keynote. So if you haven't seen Anne-Marie's keynote, please do go watch that on demand, because she's fantastic, and I've worked with her and Stimette so many times. But please do sit with the information and the knowledge that you've learned today. Please don't just push it into the background, but actually think about this as you go back to your workplace, as you go back to your homes, with your families, with your friends, when you start to celebrate different festive periods coming up, different events and celebrations. Think about how you have these conversations with your family, because what's really important here is that you listen continuously, that you provide support to those that need it, including yourself, of course, that you self-reflect, because we are not always correct all of the time. I will hold my hand up and say that I'm probably wrong more than I should be. But you need to change as well. I think the global pandemic has shown us for certain that the way that we lived before was not okay. It's also shown us that the gaps of inequity are widening and widening. Now, that means that, for example, those most affected by job losses are Pakistani and Black women in the UK, and Black women and Latin women in the US. It also means that death rates and infection rates are disproportionately affecting, for example, the Black community, and also around the different things that we've seen around the lack of support for disabled people specifically. We have to change. We have to do something more, and we have to do it better. We have to demand more, not just for ourselves, but for all different people around us. So like I said, if you want to learn more about this, you can grab my book. It also features great interviews with folks like Anne Boden, who's the CEO of Starling Bank, with Kate Richardson, who's the CEO of One Young World, and a whole host of amazing people who have done really interesting work in inclusion in their businesses and in their daily lives as well. You can get it anywhere, literally anywhere that you want. But if you do get it, please let me know, because I would love to know what you think. You can get me at shereeatcheson.com. I'm always there. And you can find out more about me there as well. And I'm at Nirashika on Twitter. But right now, I'm going to go to questions. I can see we have quite a lot of questions. I love that. So let me just end my slides just so you're looking at me and not just my slides. So let's go to the first questions. So first question is, how do I find work where I can learn and earn? I'm a mature disabled female, and I've been discriminated against a lot in the working world. I want to make a change for me, underrepresented, start life and begin my future despite so many hurdles. So firstly, thank you for sharing that. I can appreciate that that's a lot like of an emotional text to share your experiences. And I'm also really sorry that you've had those different hurdles that you mentioned being discriminated against. Firstly, what I would love for you to do, or what might be really useful for you to do, is to really analyze the companies that you're interested in working in. So there are various different, certainly in the UK, there's different, indexes, like the Valuable 500, I think it's called, which really focuses in on organizations supported on disability inclusion. What that would make sure is that you're also working with companies that really prioritize disability inclusion. When it comes to earn and learning, I think that that's a really good way to start to find someone that has been vetted. I think that's a key part. What I would also suggest, and this is just a personal suggestion, because sometimes it's easier for me to help with things like that because it's very personal, is if you want to email me through my website with maybe we can have a quick chat or something. I can have a think of any companies or things that might align as well, because it's a very specific question. The next question is, how do you deal with the imposter syndrome that comes with growing? Oh, wow. Well, I mean, I think imposter syndrome is such a funny old thing, isn't it? Because we see so many people that have, I describe it as undeserved confidence. They're very confident. They are very comfortable doing what they do, whether it's mediocre or not. And it's usually aligned with people that have quite a lot of privilege. What I did a number of years ago, I'm very confident now. I hope you can feel that, because I'm something I'm really proud of. A few years ago, I sat down and I was like, why do I feel like, why should I not be in that room? Why should I not be speaking on that stage? Why should I not have won that? Or why, when I won that award, why would I have won that? Why would they put me in that kind of thing? And I realized, I was like, I need to stop doing that. I need to simply stop doing what I am doing personally first. Firstly, number one, never self-select yourself out of something, because let somebody else do that for you, but never be the person to give yourself the no. And two, if you're feeling that kind of, I guess, imposter syndrome, which I did earlier, I definitely don't now. I spent a lot of time actually sitting down and recognizing, you know what? These are the things that I am really, really good at. I have all the awards to prove it. And then I kind of got to the stage where I was like, I am good at this. Otherwise, why would people want me to do it? And I think it's important to sit back and spend time recognizing and doing your own, almost like a performance review for yourself in your head. I also think what's really key is mentors and sponsors. They're both very different, but mentors in the first instance are really useful to help you delve into those. What's your strengths, what's your growth areas, and how do you fill them? Sponsors will help you actively do that too, if you can find one in your company. That's what's been really useful for me. But also, I'm also in the place of my life now where I'm really proud, I guess, of how much have I accomplished. And I'm kind of like, if people don't like that, I actually just don't care anymore. And I would very much suggest, once you get to the stage or comfortableness of doing that, to say that too. You will have fans and you will have people that will not get you. Make sure that you don't try to please everybody. I want to make sure I get through all the questions. We have some more here too, and they are great questions. Companies these days are more active in diversity and inclusion initiatives. Most of the time, their main only agenda is gender, because it is more, in quotes, visible and easier to handle. If you get involved in such initiatives in your company, how do you address the big issue of excluding race and other aspects from these initiatives? Are such initiatives ever going to be successful and meaningful? Okay, so the first thing is that women and gender is not a monolithic experience. And what I would suggest is that Forbes piece I mentioned, which is women are not a monolith, stop treating them as such. If you go to forbes.com/Sheree-Atcheson, or you go on my website, you'll find that article where I talk about this specific issue. If we talk about gender as a whole, we must intersect it with the data. That means we are encompassing all different kinds of people of different genders. That means ethnicity, that means disability, and so on. Now, people may start with gender data, and that's fine. What I do tell people is that you must ensure that you are considering these other elements anyway, even if you don't have that data. You cannot do one without the other. Otherwise, you end up with the problem that I mentioned earlier, which is the more privileged group of women benefiting. They can be successful and meaningful if, and this is an if they hold themselves to account and recognize that it must impact all different kinds of people from different genders, and be very specific about that. The only way to do that is holding people to account. And again, I would suggest that Forbes piece will really, really help you with that. My book also really delved into that too. Firstly, there was a comment, somebody said, let's go Ireland. I love that. Yes, let's go Ireland. So final question, I think this is the final one, just before we wrap up in the last minute. How did you build your inner confidence? I often doubt myself when I'm in the minority, gender minority, different opinions to others in the room. Similar to what I just said, I do not let anyone, and I mean zero people. I do not let anyone self-select me out of anything. I will be the only person to do that in my life now. Even in my, I'm married and I've a family with, my brother and everything else back home in Ireland. I will not let anybody decide what I'm going to do without my thought process first. What I also think is that you should sit down, you should find a mentor. There are lots of great platforms to do that now. If you're not sure of any, go to my website, email me, and I'll send you some links. To help you build that confidence and to delve into that. It's a journey, though, I will say. It doesn't just happen overnight, but you will get there. And you know what? You will be incredibly proud of the way that you're able to move forward authentically and transparently for yourself. Make sure that it's for you, it's not for anybody else. And I think that's the really, really important part of this. I hope you have enjoyed my session today. I am so sorry about my dog earlier. She's very cheeky. Again, if you're on my website, you probably see her too. But thank you so much for coming along today, for the wonderful questions. And what I would love to say is, if you are interested in demanding more, be accountable for this, keep pushing. Don't stop just because you kind of lose interest or maybe the education feels overwhelming. Just make sure that you keep going, because this is really important right now. We cannot go back to the way things were, and we cannot leave the world the way we found it. So thank you so much for listening today, and I'm going to hand back over to Udacity. And again, thank you so much for having me, folks.
Wow, Sheree, thank you so much for an amazing and compelling closing to Udacity's Women in STEM event. Before I go on, let me introduce myself. My name is Camille Padilla. I'm a Director of Product Management here at Udacity, and I identify as a woman in STEM. As I reflect back on Sheree's talk and of all the amazing speakers we heard today, I am hopeful. I'm hopeful because thanks to her talk and to what I've learned from today's speakers, I now have more resources and insights to empower me in this space. I'm hopeful because of the growing momentum and level of interest I see in ensuring proper representation for women in STEM. And lastly, I'm hopeful because of all of you who came out to say, this is important. I care about this cause and I want to be part of the change. So my ask for each and every one of you is this: to take what you've learned and put it into action. Join me, Sheree, Anuja, and the rest of our amazing speakers in being catalysts for change. Go back to your organizations and actively create opportunities for women and all underrepresented communities in STEM. We will not be able to significantly move the needle here without you. We need you and your voices as we build a future together. So before I fully say goodbye, just a couple final housekeeping items to close us out with. First, if you missed any of this great content or want to revisit a panel discussion, all sessions will be available on our website, udacity.com. Lastly, every attendee has the chance to win a Udacity scholarship, thanks to our valued customer and partner, Saudi Telecom. Just make sure you complete the survey link that will send to your email shortly. Thank you again for attending today and for joining me and all of us here at Udacity in creating greater opportunity for women in STEM. Thanks a lot and take care. Bye-bye.